work that we're doing and some of the work that our partners are doing within fish and conservation. Thank you all for coming today, and look forward to continuing this series. If you missed any of the previous series, please check them out. We posted them on our website, our YouTube channel. So we've had one with Jim McCarthy of Water Watch. He's on the line today. One on the white salmon up in Washington on their gene bank up there. And then utilizing drones for endangered species. So if any of those resonate with you at all and you'd like to check them out, please visit our website or our YouTube channel to check those out. We are going to be recording this today. So I just wanted to let everyone know so that we can share it with the community later on. So if you have any concerns with that, just wanted to get that out of the way. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking during the presentation. The chat box will be open. Feel free to send questions in during the presentation if you want to. Then we'll get to the questions at the end of the presentation. Once we wrap up with the presentation, I'm going to give a little tutorial on the ESH mapping and how to utilize the map that DSL has provided. And then we'll roll straight into questions. Feel free to unmute yourself at that time, ask any questions that you might have. We do have a couple of questions that popped in with the registration, so we'll go ahead and get to that as well. So at this time, I just want to I have the pleasure of introducing our guest speaker today, Jake Crawford. Jake's an amazing river advocate, and many of you might know this, but Jake was the Native Fish Society River Steward Program Director through the whole region for all our river stewards and helping guide Native Fish Society's work. So he's been awesome over the years. I'm very fortunate to take over as the Southern Oregon Regional Coordinator for him. I'm trying my best to fill his footsteps, but I don't know if it's happening, but I'm learning every day. And then just personally, I wanted to thank Jake because he's been awesome in helping me transition into my new role and learn what I can about Southern Oregon and all our rivers and streams here in the Pacific Northwest. So thank you, Jake. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to him for his presentation on essential salmonid habitat.
Great, thank you, Kirk, and thank you everyone for being here today at lunch. It's great to be with you. This is my first Zoom presentation. Kirk's running backup to make sure that we can at least click through my slides as I'm talking. I just got a little notice that my internet connection is unstable, so we'll do our best here. So as Kirk mentioned, I work for Flywater Travel down in Southern Oregon, which they're Patagonia bookings. But prior to joining Flywater, I worked at Native Fish Society. And so it's really awesome to be here today and to see so many friends and faces and new people that are tuning in. Just quickly about Flywater, we served as a business stakeholder in a recent process through the Department of State Lands about essential salmon habitat, which we'll be talking more about today. But really our business is to help travelers sort through an array of fishing destinations, both here at home and abroad around the globe. And we realize and recognize that at the core of every one of those fisheries is a healthy wild fish population. And so here locally, in Oregon, we work with dozens of outfitters and guides that rely on healthy fish populations. And so being able to participate in this stakeholder process is just one small way that we can contribute to this effort. I'm going to pull up my presentation here and hopefully this all clicks through for you. Let's go full screen. Does that work? Thumbs up? Sweet. So today I'm going to talk about essential salmonid habitat, and it's kind of a mouthful. So just for the purposes of me speaking clearly and people following along, I'm going to call it essential habitat. And I'll talk a little bit more about which species it's relevant for and which ones we're talking about. I'm going to provide a little bit of an example of an on-the-ground implication for conservation and how essential habitat has been used to protect native fish in Oregon by both Flywater Travel and Native Fish Society, Water Watch, and other partners throughout the state. And then we're going to look ahead at kind of why we're talking about this today and ways that you all can participate as interested parties. So first, very basic, one component of the legal or technical definition in Oregon is that it's talking about anadromous salmonids, and those are ocean going. And so here in the Northwest, we have Chinook, coho, sockeye, chum, and pink salmon, steelhead, and coastal cutthroat trout. And not every one of these species is going to be present across all the watersheds in Oregon, but these are the fish that we're talking about that are relevant for what this designation protects.
Hey, Jake.
Yeah.
Just to interrupt, we're not seeing the next slides on your page. So for some reason, we're not filtering through.
Okay.
Did you want me to kind of share your slides?
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
Cool.
Let's see. I'm going to stop my screen share.
How's that? Can everyone see my screen?
Can you make it bigger?
Let's see here.
That should work. Okay. Yeah, so going down to the next slide, we're talking about, we can't have a discussion about essential habitat without just having a really quick overview of the life cycle of salmon and trout here that are relevant and what their habitat requirements are. And so for some people, this may be very, very basic review, and for others, it's just a critical part of understanding what we're talking about today. So first, this is a salmon redd, or a nest, where they lay their eggs. And a lot happens here that is vulnerable for these fish species. And really, there's a lot of factors that are important. Successful spawning and the incubation of the eggs requires the right type of gravel for the species, the constant need for adequate flow and water quality, and all of these things have to work in unison in order for spawning to be successful. And so once the eggs are laid, they'll stay in this environment for weeks or months and then emerge. And moving forward, the juveniles will come out. They'll grow in size by eating freshwater insects, and then they'll stay in this freshwater rearing environment for a year or 2 or 3 years, depending on their species. And for anadromy, the ocean-going component of it, once they reach to the appropriate size that's predetermined by their species, they'll make their way and kind of utilize different habitat types. And so they need woody debris and sort of the right types of flows that protect them from predators and other threats to allow them to grow in size. You can continue on and see they'll use these different types of habitats that are found all throughout the state. They're going to vary in the different area. That's good. And a critical component of that is having good oxygenation. You're going to have vegetation around there to keep it cool. And then eventually they will out-migrate into the main river, the main system, and make their way through this freshwater environment to reach the Pacific Ocean. And so they'll stay out in the ocean for a year or 2 years or 3 years, depending on the species, before making their way back up to the fresh water, which is what is so amazing about our region's native fish and seagoing populations. And so you can see they'll come out of the ocean environment in mass and make their way up. And eventually they'll land back and repeat the whole process again, spawning and actually return to their river of origin. So when we talk about what their essential habitat is, back in the early 1990s, the state started to see a decline in these native fish populations, both here locally and across the Northwest. And so they established this habitat that's necessary to prevent the depletion of these, what they're calling indigenous and anadromous salmonid species, which is basically the native fish that I was just talking about. And they're protecting them at two critical life stages, the spawning and the rearing habitat. And so if you look at, reviewing these pictures, that's at the very beginning where they have the gravel that's cleaned off and the eggs. And then as juveniles, when they're hanging out in these freshwater environments. And they knew that there's all of these different sort of layers of protection, but one of them was small projects that were impacting the spawning and rearing environments. And so they formed a committee, they established the legal and technical definitions, they established the ways that these agencies would talk to one another, the Department of State Lands, the Department of Oregon Fish and Wildlife, who manages these populations, and they decided to protect them with this designation. Oregon law requires a permit for any of these small projects. And what we started to see here in Southern Oregon, and how this actually relates to on-the-ground conservation, is that we had a huge influx of suction dredge mining to the same habitats where spawning and rearing was occurring. And we know that there's a history of mining in the Northwest and settlement and this legacy, and there's a lot of people that are actively participating in this. And we also recognize that there is science that shows that there are negative impacts from this type of activity, and those weren't in line with our more modern goals of protecting these declining populations. And so working with Native Fish Society, Flywater Travel as a participant, stakeholders across the state, River Steward Stan Petrowski, who's on the call right now, we were able to use that ESH designation and the permitting of it to limit this activity in the watersheds where it didn't align with our other goals of protecting and recovering these threatened fish species. And so as a way to not outright ban that type of activity, but make sure that it was done in line with the areas that made sense for Oregon and the future that we want to have here, we were able to protect through legislation, through the Oregon State Legislature, restrict that type of activity and have it signed into Governor Brown. And then looking here at the map, this is what that looks like across Oregon. And so here in orange are all the watershed, all the waterways, creeks, channels, things that are protected throughout the state that are labeled as essential salmonid habitat. And in that process, there was a few complications or things with the current process that were exposed about some of the challenges that the maps were and how they were maintained. And so currently, changes are made to the map by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. They are the owners and the stewards of that map. They have fish biologists on staff across the state that are able to make a designation and update their map. What we saw is that the changes that were happening at the district level, at ODF&W level, weren't actually reflected in the maps at the Department of State Lands. And so you had two agencies within the state that weren't necessarily in congruency on the way that information was being distributed. It was happening every 5 years. It was admittedly a pretty laborious process through rulemaking, and the Department of State Lands and all the state agencies wanted to provide a fair, transparent, and open process for people to make changes. And so there's a number of ways where changes can benefit fish or can benefit different user groups. For one, here in the Rogue Valley where I live, There's a ton of restoration efforts that are being undertaken with nonprofits, watershed councils, state and federal agencies to remove barriers for fish and allow them to get upstream to this really high value habitat. And you go through all this effort to remove the barrier, and that gets updated in one map, but it wasn't translating to the same types of protections that would be afforded through the Department of State lands on these sort of smaller permanent. Conversely, there's things that just happen in maps and data entry where some of the interested parties were sharing that, you know, they were going to develop a property. It was listed as essential habitat, and they're using the map and they're standing on the ground, and it's a pipe, or it's not actually the type of water body that's being represented. It's an inconsistency in the map. And so it can work both ways to add habitat in places that are necessary, or update places that for whatever reason haven't been updated regularly that could impede development. So with all that in mind, the reason we're talking about it today, you can stay here, is that there was a goal to develop a process that provided for more frequent map updates. There was an 18-member committee that had different state and federal agencies, tribal nations from across the region, interested groups on both the development side and the conservation side, and small businesses such as Flywater that had a vested interest in the health of fish populations or could be impacted by these regulation changes. One of the consequences that came out was an additional 1,700 miles of rivers and streams are being proposed. And so if you look at this 2021 map that they're talking about being sort of the next iteration of that update, the granular size of this isn't very great, but what you can see is that orange is all of the 2015 maps. And in 2021, they're proposing additional expansions of those areas. The second thing, and most importantly, what came out of the process, is that now there is a more, what they're proposing is a more streamlined and forward process for participants, whether you're a NGO, a non-governmental organization, whether you are a business owner, you can propose changes to the essential habitat maps. And you still have to meet the high bar that the agencies have in order for designating those. But if you scroll down, there's basically four main categories. There's, you're providing local information. You know, is it a stream? Is it a river? What mile is it at? What are the species that are affected by, that you believe are in this area? Is it spawning or habitat, or rearing habitat? And then what are the observations or the records, or what is the evidence that you have to suggest that the current boundaries are not correct? And as a side note, there's some really cool things happening in Oregon and with eDNA. Jennifer and Kirk could talk about those as a break-off conversation about ways that you can identify the presence or absence of new fish species. There's some water typing stuff that's been happening. And so there are ways where, you know, the maps just don't accurately reflect the presence or absence of these fish species. And so having opportunities for the general public as well as experts to provide input is going to be better in the long run for the protecting native fish populations here. And so most importantly, what I think, like, as an easy takeaway for ways that common people can participate is just exploring your home waters and getting to know all the other little blue squiggly lines on the map. Personally, I'm an angler. I love to go fishing. That usually is the main way that I engage with my home waters. But I'm also finding a lot of joy in going out and looking for spawning fish in tributaries or finding juveniles and watching the way that they interact. And so there's a few benefits of that, just having more people on the ground that are aware of fish. One in particular is Jim Andrus. He's a river steward and a fishing guide. And down here in my local creek, Ashland Creek, we have spawning steelhead. And it's amazing that they're spawning steelhead right next to Lithia Park playgrounds. And we have people travel from all over the country, all over the region to experience this place. And so he's worked with ODF&W to put up little signs that say steelhead at work, and to teach people, you know, that this is habitat that's important for fish. And one reality of this whole thing too is that the enforcement agency for essential habitat violations is the Oregon State Police. And so in reality, they have a huge competing list of things that draw their attention, and arguably so, limited funds. And so the more people that we have out there that are on the ground, interacting, potentially seeing any violations such as that would be illegal for the type of activity, removal, fill, it's just better in the long run for making sure that we have a great community of people that know about our wild fish population. So, you know, with that, I think it's a great opportunity for Kurt to kind of dive in and look at ways that people can explore their home waters via map, and I'll turn it over to him.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. Great presentation. Everyone feel free to give him a virtual round of applause, I guess you could call it, with the Zoom calls these days. I'm going to go ahead and transition my screen over to that essential salmonid habitat map that Jake was explaining. It's a link that I'm going to provide for everyone in the chat box as soon as I get done with this little presentation, so that you can navigate there yourself and check out your home water. So I'm going to go ahead and refresh here. Department of State Lands has a little agreement that you have to check before you get rolling here. So it'll pop up right away when when this page loads. So it's just a disclaimer. You check the box down here, click OK. Here you can see that map that Jake showed in his presentation. Obviously, go ahead and pick your home waters or any water that you're interested in the state. Maybe you you travel to Bend area every once in a while and you want to check out what's protected over there. I'm going to go ahead and go down to my home waters, the North Umpqua River, and kind of show what I've looked at in the past and what I'm currently looking at. So I'll just kind of scroll in here, zoom in around Roseburg, 138. So right here is, let me close this box. Right here, we have the confluence of the North Umpqua River and Rock Creek. So right here, what you can do is you have your main map here, and then you have your map legend with layers. So right now I have all the layers indicated. There's other tools up here that don't mean quite as much, won't kind of help you as much. You can measure distance and whatnot. But these two layers indicate 2015 map and then the proposed changes for 2021. So if you can see here, and I'll unclick the proposed changes, it brings up the yellow for what was essential salmonid habitat in 2015. And then I can check that and put 2021, and here's what's proposed this year. So that's an easy way to utilize what's being added this go around. Like Jake said, there's 1,700 miles that have been added. So I'm going to go ahead and indicate both of those on the map. Secondly, what you can do is you can click on those little creeks that you know of that you think might have salmon habitat or anadromous fish habitat in it, and it'll bring up information on that watershed. So right here, looking at Rock Creek, I can click on it. It'll show me that it's protected. It's Rock Creek, protected for summer steelhead, mycesis. But then you can see up here, it says 1 of 5 species that it's protected for. So then I can click over and I can see spring Chinook, Rock Creek. One more, NA, not really sure what that means at this point, but it's in there. And then winter steelhead. And lastly, it looks like they have summer steelhead in there twice. So each individual stream, wherever you might be, has all of these applications available to it. So if I click on this one, it looks like there's only one species, this little watershed called Aridus. I can't even hardly read that. But it's winter steelhead. So each one of your home waters might have something different and the tributaries that supply it. If you have any questions on any of this stuff, feel free to reach out to me and give me an email. I will be sending out a little toolkit for everyone after the presentation today, and in order for them to be able to look at this map, understand what they would like to see added or changed within the plan, and move forward. Another thing that we will be sending out is a template to submit comments for all this ESH work that the Department of State Lands did. In that template, though, you'll be able to help support adding those 1,700 miles of ESH habitat to the designation. And with that, we'll also be able to supply your own comments of maybe your home waters that weren't added to the map this year. So with that, I'm going to kind of conclude the presentation, and we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. So if anyone has any burning questions, please go for it.
We did it. We solved them all.
We got them all, didn't we? We did have a couple that came in. I'm going to go ahead and pull those up here and ask Jake a few of these. The first one was more general, and if Jake can't answer it, I do have some suggestions for it. But how do you combat the hatchery programs? They're being added too faster than the dams are being removed and continue to disrupt fish. Did you want to give a little on that, or do you want me to kind of tackle that one?
Oh, I think it's a really good question, and it's relevant to this discussion, and that the spawning and rearing habitat is the hatchery of the environment. That's where all the business is happening, and that's where they're going to be hanging out in that rearing environment before they go to the ocean. And so anything that we can do to make sure that spawning and rearing habitat is protected and maintained and watched, and we have as much of it as possible, is going to give less of an argument for hatchery fish in the future. That's kind of my broad approach to that answer. So
yeah, and one thing I would just add to it is our website has great info on hatcheries and the impacts that they have on our fisheries. And so please check that out. We have an awesome new tool up there under the hatcheries tab. It's called the Hatchery Dashboard. It shows how many hatchery fish are located in each watershed, similar to the ESH map. It's kind of a map of our Pacific Northwest, showing how many hatchery fish are being released into our waters. The next question for you, Jake, came in from Stan. How come sea run cutthroat trout are rarely added to these lists?
Yeah, that's a good question, Stan. And I think I won't speak to Oregon Fish and Wildlife per se, but I will say that my experience with talking with Fish and Wildlife in Washington and some of the work that Native Fish Society did on cutthroat is that in the long list of species that draw in money for the state and federal agencies, there's a lot at the top before coastal cutthroat. And so I think that part of it is just allocation of resources. Even though the mandate by ODF&W is to protect all of the native fish species, they also have to do their best with a limited budget. And unfortunately, there's not A, as much information about those species, and B, probably as much resources to go around. So I think that the more that we learn about them and the more that there's interest and opportunities to study them cost effectively, we see it with other things too. There's winter steelhead and coho share a lot of the same mapping. And so they often use coho as a proxy for winter steelhead. when they make determinations on habitat types. And so coho are a federally listed species, and so they bring in a lot of dollars that directly target surveys and other types of management for them. But again, even steelhead are at the bottom of that list too in some instances. So I think, yeah, definitely important and more widely dispersed than maybe many of the other populations.
Awesome.
Yeah, Jake, can I comment?
Please.
So here about 15 years ago, we attempted to have the South Umpqua sea run cutthroat listed under the Endangered Species Act because they are seriously threatened in the Umpqua Basin. It was turned down because for the same reason that the previous spring Chinook petition was turned down. Basically, they consider the genetics of entire ESU the same fish. And I'm wondering if Mike Miller's work going forward will have a bearing on that. And if it does, perhaps the Native Fish Society would provide a pathway for river stewards to engage the process.
No, that's I mean, that's great, Stan. I'll kind of look into that and kind of follow up with you on that. That works for you. Our next question was from Ben. Is ESH relevant to resident rainbow populations, knowing that Omicus have the potential to display various life histories, including anadromy?
That's an awesome question. Yeah, I mean, I think this might not answer it, but one of the limitations I would say in the ESH, and you can really see it when you look at the map, is that there are native salmonids across the entire state, whether it's a red band rainbow trout or a bull trout in Eastern Oregon. And so the way that the language was written when the statutory language was written didn't include those populations. And when we got together to have this committee process, they sort of took that off the table on any discussion of sort of addressing some of those limitations in the language. It wasn't under the scope. And so I think from the coastal population, at least here in the Rogue that I'm familiar with, they don't really consider a lot of the rainbow trout to be residents. We definitely have some in the upper part next to the dam, but most of the coastal populations are considered steelhead. And so it's really the interior populations like in the upper Deschutes that are behind dams that don't have that. I don't know how it works in the lower Deschutes where you definitely have like red band and rainbows, but I imagine that those areas are overlapping, and so they probably use one as a proxy too.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. This next question came in from Samuel Harris. I know you talked a bit about dredging causing habitat problems. How do we see malpractice, clear cut, small buffers, and forestry and timber industry causing problems with salmonid habitat? I can kind of kick this one off if you want me to, Jake. One was our last lunch and learn, and you can kind of reference back to that if you would like. It's posted on our website. There's it's called Landsides to Log Jams is kind of our campaign working towards that. But that's a great telling story of some of the impacts that the logging is currently having on our salmonid habitat. And yeah, so I mean, there's one for sure. I don't want to call Jennifer out on this, but she's been working hard on that campaign. So if Jennifer had anything to add to it, I'd let her as well. or Jake, sorry, Jake.
I'll let Jake start since he's the featured speaker.
Okay, sorry, Jake.
Am I on mute still?
No.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. And I think, you know, my mind gets going in a bunch of different ways. The first thing is thinking that, you know, for the purposes of essential salmonid habitat and the way that's regulated through the Department of State Lands, is that they're talking about in the suction dredge mining activity that I used as an example, that's talking about small removal fill projects that kind of are in their own sort of class of agency management. But thinking about the landslides, the log jams campaign, and the way that these upper level watershed stuff is not contributing to the development of the essential habitat that is required by this native fish species is an interesting question, because one of the things that they require are these really complex log jam structures to protect them from predators and to help and to provide shelter. And so there's definitely a connection there ecologically between it. And then I just can't speak to whether there's like a legal connection as far as the technical definition of what essential and indigenous anadromous salmonid habitat actually qualifies for. So I think for me, I'm like, great question. Let's explore that further.
Yeah, and I think just to complement what Jake said is, you know, we have these ecosystems that are very integrated together from, you know, the ridge lines down to the rivers, but the way we conceive of the kind of legal overlay of human activities across those landscapes aren't integrated in the same way. And so essential salmonids habitat is very specific to activities that are legally defined as removal fill in a river. So they don't necessarily, as far as I know, overlay specifically with other types of activities. I'd have to look into whether or not, you know, other state agencies utilize the designation as a marker while they're doing work on things like habitat conservation plans, which the Department of Forestry is currently engaged in, or other work, you know, across agencies and ownership types. So I think that's one of the things that is tricky about the way we've structured our laws and tried to apply them across, you know, integrated landscapes.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer and Jake. Our next question, I would like, Chelsea raised her hand for a while there. If you would like to ask your question, or I can read it, just let me know.
I can ask it if that's better. Just as with this process of making it also easier to remove streams from the map, is that a concern with kind of assuming that section? I went to the hearings last week about it, and there was a miner that showed up and was saying, you know, that it sounded like he was going to be, you know, proposing removal. So I was just curious if that's a concern and how we should address that in our comments.
That's a great question. And to be honest, that was one of the central reasons that I even agreed to participate, was that I worked on, like with Native Fish Society, with Stan and Mark and all the people over the years to reform that activity and to get them that activity out of the areas that it didn't make sense for our recovery goals. And I was really concerned, like, how easy is it to take ESH off the map? Two things. One is that the miners were invited and did participate in the stakeholder process as an interested party. They left halfway through the process out of protest because they were asking the agency to take on subjects that weren't germane to the issue or relevant to the, I mean, relevant, but not germane or under their jurisdiction. And so they didn't even finish that process, trying every avenue they can to throw a stick in the spokes of this work. And two, like walking away from it, I felt comfortable that there still is some rigor to determining whether or not something is going to qualify or not qualify as essential habitat. There's, after you submit those sort of 4 criteria, you still have to go under the review of a fish biologist, and there may even be some like site specific components to it. And so I think from a commenting standpoint, making sure that you put in their concerns about reversing decisions and having them address those in the comments is one way to ensure that issue is considered. There's also some other points about like how frequently they update it when new barriers are created or when barriers are removed. And so how are they going to do that with climate change considerations? And so I think a lot of what this process was looking for that type of feedback, because they're going from a 5-year interval rulemaking, which is really onerous, to an expensive for the state, also prohibitive for the normal person to participate, to now providing a more open and transparent way for the general public to provide comments and make suggestions. And there's definitely concern by the state agencies to say, like, are we just going to get inundated or flooded with people who are opportunistic and trying to reverse essential salmon habitat, or are they legitimate and not frivolous claims? And how can we address those in a timely and respectful fashion? That being said, also making sure that, how do they even let people know about this thing that has a funky name and is kind of a barrier to entry? And how do they communicate that with people who aren't policy professionals? And how do they communicate that to the tribes who also have a vested interest? And so there was a lot of discussion around that. And I think that this comment period that Kirk's going to share, they're looking for those types of input for someone like yourself that wants, has this concern, wants to participate. And the task at hand for the agency is to figure out a way to help you and everyone else participate in a meaningful way.
So just to be clear, Jake, they haven't defined how they're going to create a more like ongoing process into the future, so that it's like not these every 5 years, just that they want to do that.
No, it's in the proposal right now. And it's like, there's a fiscal note attached to it. Like, we're going to invest in outreach and we're going to communicate and give people X amount of time in order to respond. And so much, I imagine it's going to be really similar to like if there's a fish passage waiver right now, where if somebody wants to build and there's their development is going to impact the passage of fish through that water body, they need to apply for a permit and they can get it waived. And then that waive gets sent out to interested parties. There's a timeline for people to respond, and then a judgment is made. And I think that's probably the type of system that they're proposing for ESH designations. And some of the nitty gritty, like legalese stuff is like, well, do we propose those in February and then make a decision in December? Or do we propose those, do we allow a rolling basis for people to provide those types of suggestions and then tackle them one by one? So yeah, that's kind of what our task was in providing feedback to the state agency.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. And there was one other question that came in the chat from Gabe about, does this map include where native fish spawn currently, or does it incorporate where they historically spawned as well? It is right now current spawning fish. And that's why if you do look at the map, they've taken stream systems out. They've removed some in 2020. So that's why it's really important you check and make sure that your home waters are protected and included on there. Awesome. There were a few more questions that came in via the entries. I'll go ahead and follow up with some of those after the presentation, but we are kind of at time here today. It was an exciting presentation. Thank you so much, Jake. Again, I want to remind everyone that Native Fish Society will be sending out a template to provide comments along with a little toolkit that'll help you guys be able to speak up and share your voice about the essential salmonid habitat in your home water. So during that time, it'll be early next week. So if you have time, please check out that DSL map. Make sure that your waters are on there. Any streams or tributaries that you might be questioning, and share that map, share that toolkit with any of your other friends or conservation advocates so they can reach out as well. Feel free to respond to that my email. My email is kirk@nativefish.org. So give me any feedback you have, and then please share with us any feedback you might have about our Lunch and Learn series. We'd love to hear from you and hear if you enjoyed it and what we can do to make it better. So thank you all. With that, I want to
clarification. When is the deadline for comments for this portion of the ESH considerations? I think it's March 6th.
March 4th.
4th. Okay.
So that's late next week. And that's why we will have our comment template out to everyone early next week, Monday probably. And then make it easy for everyone. It'll be a one-click template, or you can adjust it. So keep your eyes peeled for that and share it around, please. Love to hear from everyone. And lastly, huge thanks to Jake. Great job. Thanks for coming back, and thanks for all your help and guidance with everything.
Anytime. Thanks, Kirk and Mark and Jennifer and Jay Michelle and Stan and everybody. It's so good to see you all. My mom and dad even came in. This is awesome.